Watching. This is the Sanford Zoo PnP4 Dazel project. I decided to do a warthog named Pumbaa, and I started with basically laying out how I wanted to do the actions, which I did in a switch statement using strings, so I could more clearly define in the inspector what I wanted the action to be, which you can see right here. And I made those states, so there's 6 of them, and it's not a linear progression by any means. It bounces back and forth using the different variables that I've set. Now, most of these are floats. There's a couple of different arrays of floats that I'm using for turning angles so that it's not the same path every single time. There's a bunch of randomization here. A bunch of Boolean checks for bouncing back and forth between states, and integers to count each time that I've passed a full state, or a full round of that state. So keeping all of these, I've very efficiently made a way to bounce very quickly between states and different action events without any hiccup, and it's very smooth. And then lastly, I just wanted to lay out how I was going to do the logic, and I wanted to do the logic at a smooth rate, but not too fast, so it's not doing too much calculation, and it's just at 24 frames per second, which is 0.04 in the time stop. And basically, all of the actions are laid out here. And I think the most difficult things that I had to do was when I was charging, I would charge towards an object, but if the object was just a couple more degrees up on the y-axis, it would throw everything off, and my warthog would just start going upward or downward, or in whatever direction. So I actually had to use some documentation here to get some information on that. And this is very nice. So I took his idea here, modifying the y value, and just putting that into the rotation. And I didn't do anything actually like this. I kind of modified it in my own way. I developed my own vector 3 that just took into account, here it is. I took into account the target's position on the x and z only, but kept my transform on the y, so that I would always run towards an object, but never up or down. And that was pretty interesting to get developed. And I used a couple of other things here. Like I said, everything's randomized. Like I mentioned the arrays earlier, and here I figured out how to do random of the array's length just by doing so. I set up, this is my array up here. So I've got an array of turn angles and turn around angles. So these are specifically the opposite and to a degree, and these are turning in any degree. And I've got some duplication in there because I wanted some values to be picked more than others. But it's this very, very nice and efficient. And rotation rate is another float that I just put in there a little while ago. It's another float array because during my idle state, it does a rotation. So my idle timer, which is randomized, so it's never idle for more than a certain amount of time, it just rotates based on the turn direction. So either -1 on the y-axis or 1 on the y-axis, which is the rotation vector 3. I figured out. So this is actually a 0. It's registered as a 0 to 1 scale, even though we rotate more than that. It's actually registered the angles themselves, and that was pretty cool to find out. And then I multiplied it by pi to get a smooth rotation at a good rate. And that's basically, so this is the documentation for my warthog. And I basically just did 2 of the different states here because I go into that state, and this is the most interesting state, and I'll explain why in a little bit. The unmoving warthog doesn't move at all. The wandering warthog moves 0.1 units, which you can see in my wandering state here, it is moving at a vector 3 forward times 1 at 25 frames a second. And then in the charging state, it is moving 0.5, which you can see, vector forward 0.5. And I only did, so my Warthog doesn't have health per se. It just gets destroyed if it wants to be destroyed by another animal, because I've seen in class a couple of other animals are destructive, or it kills others. But it doesn't actually have any of that. It just has fatigue and hunger. And an item that I have that I didn't really see was actually an item is food, and that's just these spheres, and it's a CS food script that I'm finding. And I just go up and I go into the eat state. And I'll show you that in the, because I'm running on time here. I'll show you that in a second. And the Warthog tool is his head, because the charge state actually adds a force at the position at the transformed up plus transformed forward times 10, and that you can see here in the charge state. So when it hits, it adds a rigid body and a CS killer. So it hits, it goes flying, lands and dies, and add force at position, the force direction, which I'm getting here, which is transformed forward times 10 at my position, and it's an impulse. It's and it works. And then after it does that, it does a turnaround and goes in the opposite direction. So without further ado, I would like to go ahead and play. We're just going to do a quick rendition here. So it's going to start on the wander state, which you can see here. Okay, so it ran straight into the food, so it's going into the eat state here. And now the eat state is just a coroutine. It is a coroutine that is right up here, and it just waits for a few seconds, and then it destroys the food object, and then goes back into the wander state. So here it's wandering, and then it's going to go into idle in a couple of seconds here. Whenever it hits something, I've got rays being drawn that turn it every frame, and then it goes, every time it goes into the, oh, it's hungry again. So every time the hunger reaches 6, so the actual value for that is hunger mod 6 equals 0, then eat. So it goes into that state every 6 hunger rotations, which gets incremented on the wander rotations. And then I will show you here, we can do, oh, it's about to go into the charge state. And now it just hit that, and then that. My killer script did not instantiate properly there, but it does. So now it's in the sleep state, and this is just a wait for 20 seconds, and then it's raising the sleep count, and then going back into wander. So you'll see it go back into wander in a second here. Oh, in a few seconds. Now it's back into wander. And that's basically the whole thing. Every once in a while it charges at something, and then it gets stuck. There we go. That's interesting. So you can actually mess with the values here. That has not happened in any of my other runs with this, but it does work very smoothly in other renditions here. Now it's tired again. So whenever the fatigue gets to 60, it goes to sleep because it's too tired. And that's basically, and then it resets to 3 because I'm adding, and if you go back to 0, I'm doing everything using mod functions, and if you mod a 0 by any number, it just retrieves a 0, so you can't mod by 0, so I always start on a different number and then add that. But yes, that is basically the whole function. Alright?